This week in lab, we'll be studying the human muscular system. Let's take a look at your learning objectives for these 3 labs. For lab quizzes and practical exams, you're responsible for describing muscle names, the locations on the human muscle models and on images if specified, actions of each muscle as written in the lab manual, skeletal attachments as written in the lab manual for selected muscles, right and left designations on models and on images, and the composition of muscle groups listed at the back of your lab exercise. When identifying human muscles, make sure you write the names completely and correctly. Confusing the names of 2 similar muscles will be graded as though you've written an incorrect answer, rather than being graded as a spelling error. For example, if the pointer is on the zygomaticus minor and you write zygomaticus major, you'll lose full credit for your answer. You have in essence named a completely different muscle. Pay very close attention to your muscle names as you study them. Pay attention to the criteria, as you can see cover a number of different modes. For example, muscles can be named based on their location. Intercostal means between the ribs. Orbicularis oris indicates that it's around the mouth. Pectoralis on the pectoral region. Supraspinatus above the spine of the scapula, just to name a few. The shape of the muscle, like deltoid, meaning triangular, rectus meaning straight, teres meaning round. The relative size of the muscle plays a role. So latissimus means wide, brevis means short, longissimus means long, major means great, minor means lesser. The direction of the fibers and the fascicles making up the muscle, they all run straight, it's a rectus muscle. Oblique means they run at an angle, and transverse means they run perpendicular. The number of heads oftentimes is associated with the names. Biceps means 2, triceps means 3, quadriceps means 4. The location of the attachments, for example, with sternocleidomastoid, the word sterno meaning sternum, cleido meaning clavicle, and mastoid indicating mastoid process. And finally, the action of the muscle. So flexor, extensor, levator, constrictor, dilator, adductor, abductor. Oftentimes muscles are named for these actions. So when learning the name of a muscle, stop, consider what its components might mean, and then move forward. So again, you are responsible for muscle actions as written in the lab manual. So you must be able to reproduce these and or recognize them. Questions about a muscle's action could be worded: list all actions of this muscle when a muscle has been pointed to on a muscle model or image. Or name the muscle responsible for blank, and a specific action would be listed. Keep in mind that these muscle actions reflect the movement of specific joints, so you should familiarize yourself with the descriptions of the movement of each joint listed in the lab exercise and textbook. This is a list of all the actions you should know as you're learning how each muscle works. Again, reference your textbook to help you with these. Finally, skeletal attachments. Again, we are only having you learn specific attachment sites for muscles as indicated in this table. We do not ask you to know attachments for all muscles, nor do we ask you to know all attachments for muscles that have been indicated. Historically, these attachment sites were dictated as origins versus insertions, but we won't require you to classify them as such. Articulated skeletons will be provided in lab each week to help you with identification of these attachment sites. And we recommend that you walk over to the skeleton and place your fingers on all attachment sites of the muscles. Since muscle actions are carried out by contraction, essentially what you can do is put your finger on 2 attachment sites and then facilitate what would happen during contraction by drawing your fingers closer together. This can help you understand how those 2 points are pulled towards one another as a muscle contracts. When designated, you must be able to indicate an attachment site as proximal or distal. So just to make sure you're familiar, when looking at attachment sites, they used to be classified as origins versus insertions. Origins historically are the immovable sites of a muscle attachment. This is where a muscle is anchored, whereas an insertion is the more movable attachment site. So as the biceps brachii begins to contract and shorten, it pulls on the radius, causing it to move, whereas the humerus and the scapula stay planted in place. In week 1, you'll be studying muscle histology, as well as the muscles of tables 5.1 and 5.2. For histology, you'll have a demo slide with 3 different types of muscle tissue at the end of each lab table. In lab, you are responsible for identification of this type of muscle tissue as well as any labeled components on the slides. You'll see here images from your lab histology guide of each of these muscle tissue types, and above it is a table describing the different locations, functions, and control types associated with each muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, seen here, is responsible for overall body mobility by pulling on bones. This is voluntary, so you control it consciously. And the slides are unique because the muscle fibers are long and cylindrical with stripes or striations running through them. They're also multinucleate, which means they have more than one nucleus per cell. As you move to cardiac muscle, these are involuntary, so you cannot consciously control them. Rather, they're regulated through pacemaker cells and neural stimulation. Much like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated, so you'd see little stripes running through the fibers. But in addition to that, they have what are known as intercalated discs. These look like very dark striations, but really are just the junctions between neighboring cardiac muscle fibers. They are uninucleate, meaning that they have one nucleus per muscle fiber. Cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. The third of the three is going to be smooth muscle. This is also involuntary, and since it lines the inner parts of the walls of hollow organs, like blood vessels or digestive organs, its role is to force fluids and other substances through those long channels or tubes. You'll notice that visually here, smooth muscle cells are non-striated, which is where they get their name. They're spindle shaped, so they taper on the ends, and they're uninucleate, one nucleus per cell. As you move into identification of the muscles, it's important to recall that on the models themselves, they are going to look much like you see in this image. Superficial muscles will be visible on the right side of the model, here, and on the posterior view here. And on the left sides of the models, you'll see deeper muscles. So the superficial layers have been removed to show you which muscles are underneath. That means that muscles may not be visible on both sides of the models that you view, so keep this in mind as you're studying. Table 5.1 covers muscles of the head and the neck, and as you read through the list, you'll see that many of them are on the face and are associated with facial expressions, as well as opening and closing the eyes, opening and closing the mouth, and then mastication or chewing. So as you're learning these muscles, first name them, and then essentially draw their location with your finger as you're studying the muscle on the model, and say the name out loud while you do this, and then do the action. So as you look at the masseter muscle, you would utilize elevation and retraction of the jaw, so opening and closing the mouth, and then lateral and medial excursion, moving the jaw side to side. You'll do the same thing here for the anterior part of the face, tracing the muscle, naming the muscle, and then doing the action. The levator palpebrae superioris is one of the muscles you will not be able to see on the model, and so I show you here in this image that this is going to be a muscle that extends from the bony socket of the orbit all the way to the eyelid. Its name, levator, indicates that it elevates the palpebrae, which is the eyelid. As we move into the muscles of the neck, you see the sternocleidomastoid, the scalenes, and the Splinius Capitis. It's important to highlight the actions they facilitate, so we're going to take a look at that just very quickly. When you're studying the neck and the back, flexion is any time that you bend the neck or the back forward, like you see right here. And extension is any time you stand up, right? And then hyperextension is bending backwards. Lateral flexion, on the other hand, is any time that you bend the spine or the neck side to side. So tilting the head side to side would be considered lateral flexion. Likewise, rotation is any time you spin on an axis. So rotation of the vertebral column is spinning the whole torso, whereas rotation of the neck is just spinning the head side to side. As you place these muscles, keep in mind again that you may not be able to see them on both sides of the model. Here in this image, you can see one sternocleidomastoid on the right side, and on the left it has been removed. And underneath that, you would see the scalenes. So here you can see the left sternocleidomastoid, and below that, the scalenes muscle group. These muscles are named individually, but you are not responsible for knowing their individual names. Now we look at these two together because both the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes have similar function. Let's go back to this image to discuss it. Reading the action of sternocleidomastoid, you see first the word unilateral. Unilateral indicates that only one muscle of the two is contracting. So even though you would have sternocleidomastoid on the right and on the left side, unilateral contraction tells you that only the right or the left is contracting. If you read the description, you'll see the word bilateral. Bilateral is when the muscles on both sides, right and left, contract simultaneously. We indicate this in the action because it brings about two different sorts of activities in the body. So first off, with the sternocleidomastoid and the scalenes, it says that unilateral action causes ipsilateral flexion. Ipsilateral means to the same side. So if the right sternocleidomastoid has unilateral contraction, it means the head will tilt towards the side of the contracting muscle. Same thing if you look at these scalenes. They're pictured on the left side of the neck. If they contract, then the head is going to tilt toward those contracting muscles. It also says that this unilateral action will cause contralateral rotation. If ipsilateral means the same side, contralateral means the opposite. So if the right sternocleidomastoid contracts, it's going to cause contralateral rotation where the chin turns to face away from that contracting muscle. Same here with the scalenes. This ipsilateral, you would have ipsilateral flexion where the head could tilt towards the scalenes, but that unilateral contraction would cause contralateral rotation, causing the chin to turn and face away from those muscles themselves. When you look at bilateral action, that tells you for both muscles that the head flexes forward as when looking down. And so if the muscles on both sides are contracting equally, the head does not turn to the left or to the right, it stays straight and flexes straight down. Here you can get a good idea of where those muscles sit. The sternocleidomastoid is going to be more superficial, and so you can see the scalenes just underneath them. There they are. Again, because they are attached more towards the front here, that's going to pull the head forward as they contract. You contrast that with the Splinius Capitis. Here you can see it. It's underneath this large trapezius, so it is a deep muscle. And so in this image from APR, I've pulled away the trapezius so you can see the bilateral layout of the Splinius Capitis. With unilateral contraction, this is still going to cause ipsilateral flexion, meaning if the Splinius Capitis on the right has unilateral contraction, the head will tilt towards the right, towards that contracting muscle. However, instead of contralateral rotation, this actually causes ipsilateral rotation because it attaches here to the back of the head. And so this unilateral contraction of the Splinius Capitis would cause the chin to rotate towards that Splinius Capitis. Now when we look at bilateral contraction, because both parts of the muscles are on the back of the head, you're going to pull the head backwards towards the contracting muscle. And so that's why you say it has, with bilateral contraction, you would see extension of the neck. So we move on then to table 5.2 to muscles of the chest, shoulders, and back. Once again, keep in mind that superficial muscles like the trapezius and the deltoid may be visible on the left side, the right side of the model, whereas on the left side of the model you would see the more deep muscles. I realize that it's reversed here, but pay attention to where they're located on the model itself. And so we're going to look at three layers of these muscles essentially. The trapezius and the deltoid are visible here superficially. Just deep to those, you have the rhomboideus minor and major, as well as the levator scapulae, supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, teres major, serratus anterior. And then deep to that, you have the erector spinae group. So pay attention to the location of each of these muscles. With that erector spinae group, it is important to know it not just as a group, but you should also know the individual muscles. The spinalis is more medially along the spines of the vertebrae. Intermediate then are the longissimus muscles, and the most lateral is the iliocostalis muscles. These are all on the back, so as they contract, they tend to pull you erect. So they pull you upwards so that you are standing straight and tall. You'll see in their description of their action, they can also be associated with lateral flexion, so they would be ipsilateral contractors pulling you towards the contracting side. Now, as you move on then and take a look at the muscles that are associated with the shoulder, you see a wide variety of actions. So muscles associated with the shoulder and the chest, here's your pectoralis major, the deltoid, right, looking on the posterior side again, supraspinatus, here's the infraspinatus, teres minor, teres major, here's the latissimus dorsi right through there. And so you see a number of new actions here because these are associated with the scapula and with the shoulder or the arm. With abduction, this is any time that you move the arm away from the body, and adduction is when you move the arm towards the body, just like when you're doing jumping jacks. You can rotate the shoulder medially by rolling it inward, and lateral rotation rolls it outwards. Finally, you have circumduction here, where you make a circle with the tips of your fingers by moving only at the shoulder. In addition to that, we're going to see some motion here at the shoulder associated with flexion of the arm and extension of the arm. Flexion of the arm at the shoulder is anytime you move the arm forward in this body plane, and then extension and hyperextension are when you move the arm backwards at the shoulder. In placing the muscles of the shoulder, pay very close attention to what's superficial and what's deep. The deltoid is most superficial, and it wraps here posteriorly and all the way around to the front. Because of the great body of the deltoid, you'll notice that it plays a role in a number of functions. Abduction, because as it grabs onto the humerus, it can lift it up like this, but it can also pull backwards to cause extension of the shoulder, or the front parts of the deltoid can pull it forward to give you flexion of the shoulder. So pay attention again. Location is going to give you an idea of what kinds of actions are capable of. As you continue to move on, you can see here that nice wide infraspinatus below the spine of the scapula, supraspinatus above the spine of the scapula. When you take a look at the teres minor and the teres major, it's important to pay attention to where they sit. So to begin with right here, you can see the teres major, wrapping from the back of the scapula here underneath the humerus to articulate there on the anterior side of the humerus. When you look at the teres minor, this is different. The teres minor begins on the back of the scapula and then runs here to the front, runs here also to the back of the scapula. If you look at the descriptions of their actions, you'll see here that they have two different types of rotation. With the teres major, since it rolls underneath the humerus here, that's going to cause medial rotation. Since it pulls on the front of the humerus, it pulls the humerus around so that you medially rotate the shoulder. Whereas with teres minor, because it's attached here to the outside of the humerus, it pulls the humerus backwards, giving you lateral rotation. So pay attention to the difference in motion of those two just based on location. As you look through other descriptions of muscles, you'll find that infraspinatus is also going to have a similar motion to the teres minor because of its attachment site. And likewise, the latissimus dorsi wraps around to the anterior side of the humerus, so it's going to give you some medial rotation of the shoulder, just like that teres major does. Now, of course, placement on the shoulder itself is a little bit unique. The subscapularis is hard to identify because it's actually underneath the scapula. It's on that subscapular fossa right there, where all the rest tend to be a little bit more visible when you're thinking about them in terms of the muscle models. So don't forget about subscapularis. The actions here on the scapula can be a little bit tricky, so let's go through each of these types of actions on their own. So to begin with, you'll see elevation and depression of the scapula. And this is any time that you move the scapula up to elevate or pull it down for depression. You can see here just a quick list of all the muscles that pull up on the scapula. The levator scapulae, trapezius, rhomboids, both do that. And then depression, the trapezius again. Remember, he's a big muscle, so he can attach to both the superior and the inferior parts of the scapula. And then the serratus anterior also is associated with depression. The other two motions that you see with the scapula are protraction and retraction. So protraction here would be used anytime you're pushing a door open, right? So just like you can see in this image, you're pushing that way and the scapula slides forward. The pectoralis minor and the serratus anterior are both on the front of the body, so they're pulling the scapula towards the front in protraction. When you look at retraction here, retraction is as you pull the scapula back, like when you're pulling your shoulders backward with good posture. It's the muscles in the back of the scapula that help to do this, the rhomboid groups and the trapezius. And then finally here, you start to see abduction and adduction. Even though these are motions that are acting on the shoulder, the scapula has to rotate to allow the arm itself to either abduct or adduct. And so anytime you see abduction, where the arm swings away, you tend to see lateral rotation of the scapula as the inferior angle here begins to swing towards the outside of the body. Keep in mind here that this would be the right arm, right, the right shoulder. So her right shoulder there. Right? Also her right shoulder there. Again, you're looking at the posterior part of the scapula. Lateral rotation is carried out by the trapezius and the serratus anterior, rotating towards the direction of the red arrow. And medial rotation tends to take place whenever adduction is occurring, where you pull the arms down closer to the body, or even as the arms go back behind you. And that's going to use the levator scapulae and the rhomboids groups to pull that inferior angle towards the spine. So those can be tricky. Make sure that you pay attention to whether you're moving the scapula or the arm at the shoulder. That tends to be a place students get the most confused. Be prepared to act out all of these actions as you're studying them, giving you better muscle memory, pun intended. And good luck this week.